Everyone said the Ashdown Ball would be the crowning glory of the season. From the gallery above the ballroom, Eleanor Ashdown watched her family's triumph unfold like a scene from a play in which she had somehow forgotten her lines. Crystal chandeliers blazed, scattering light across silk gowns and polished boots. Laughter rose and fell in glittering waves. A string quartet sang out the steps of a waltz, and the polished floor shone like a frozen lake beneath the dancers' feet. Somewhere in the center of it all stood her former fiancé and her cousin. Former, she whispered, the word bitter on her tongue. Below, Edmund Harrow, handsome, composed, every blonde curl in place, lifted Marianne's hand to his lips. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the vicar concluded the last quiet words of the marriage blessing. The ceremony, hastily arranged to precede the ball, had been brief. It had also been public enough that no one in London could possibly miss the fact that the gentleman who had once been promised to Miss Eleanor Ashdown now belonged, irrevocably, to Miss Marianne Ashdown. Now Lady Marianne Harrow, Eleanor corrected herself, fingers digging into the carved railing. She had thought she understood disappointment before. She had not. Not until her father, looking unusually pale, had explained that Edmund's estate could not support both her dowry and the urgent debts that threatened Ashdown House. Not until Marianne, sweet, lovely Marianne, had accepted the proposal meant for Eleanor with a trembling smile and an apology that never quite reached her eyes. It had all been reasonable, sensible, respectable, and it felt standing there above the crowd like an overlooked ornament, like the quiet undoing of her entire life. Miss Ashdown, the soft voice at her side, made Eleanor start. She hadn't realized anyone had joined her in the gallery. She turned and found her mother's maid, Betsy, curtsying nervously. "Your aunt asked if you will come down for the next set, miss," Betsy said. "She says it does not do for you to be hiding away." Hiding, the word stung. Eleanor straightened her spine. "I am not hiding," she answered, though both of them knew she was. "Tell my aunt I will join her presently." When Betsy had gone, Eleanor drew a long, steadying breath. She was 25, not a child. She would not weep in shadows while the world watched. If this night had rearranged her future without her consent, she would at least face it with dignity. She smoothed her pale blue gown, lifted her chin, and descended the narrow staircase to the ballroom. The scent of beeswax and roses wrapped around her, almost suffocating. Couples moved in graceful patterns, colors blurred, emerald, ivory, deep plum, as skirts swished and coats brushed past. Conversations dipped and rose, threaded with laughter, and that particular tone of speculation society wore like a second skin. Her aunt, Lady Agatha, spotted her at once. "There you are," Lady Agatha said sharply, catching her elbow. "You look wan. Smile, child. People are watching." "I am attempting to smile," Eleanor replied, arranging her lips into what she hoped resembled one. "It appears my face has other opinions. This is not the time for obstinacy. The Harrows have done us a great kindness. You must show that there is no ill feeling. No ill feeling." Eleanor's gaze drifted beyond her aunt's shoulder to where Edmund and Marianne received their guests. Marianne was radiant in ivory satin, golden hair threaded with pearls. Edmund's hand rested at the small of her back with effortless familiarity. There was no sign he remembered the quiet garden where he had once asked Eleanor to be his wife. "Of course, aunt," Eleanor said softly. "No ill feeling at all." She could not bear it. Not another moment. Without fully realizing she meant to move, she slipped from her aunt's grasp, weaving through the crowd toward the nearest open terrace doors. A burst of cool night air met her as she stepped outside, the murmur of the ballroom fading behind her. Lanterns gleamed along the balustrade, their flames shivering in the early spring breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rattled along the street, and the stars looked down with distant indifference. Only then did her composure crack. Her breath caught sharp and painful, and she pressed a hand to her middle as if she could hold herself together by sheer will. "It is only a rearrangement," she whispered to the night. "Not an ending." Not an ending. Her eyes blurred anyway. She did not see the figure standing at the far end of the terrace until she nearly collided with him. "Oh!" Eleanor gasped, stumbling back. The stranger's hand shot out, steadying her with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to emergencies, even small social ones. "I beg your pardon," he said, releasing her once she had found her balance. His voice was low and smooth, colored by the faintest hint of amusement. "I had thought myself safely out of the way." Eleanor, mortified, forced herself to look up and froze. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes like storm clouds held just at bay. His evening clothes were impeccably cut, but it was not their quality that struck her. It was the air about him, as if he were slightly aside from the world he moved in, watching rather than participating. She knew that face. Everyone in London did. "Your Grace," she managed, curtsying. I did not realize, forgive me. The Duke of Ravensfield inclined his head, a shadow of a smile touching his mouth. There is nothing to forgive, Miss Ashdown, she said, the word catching in her throat. Eleanor Ashdown. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his gaze. Sharp interest, swiftly masked. Miss Ashdown, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the shape of her name. The very house that tonight celebrates a most unexpected union. Heat rushed to her cheeks. You are very well informed, Your Grace. In my position one must be, he said calmly. Then more quietly, and yet I suspect the story told in that room is incomplete. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself against the chill, though she was suddenly not sure whether it came from the night air or his words. I do not know what you mean, she said. The Duke studied her for a moment. The music drifted through the open doors, a bright waltz at odds with the quiet intensity on the terrace. Tell me, Miss Ashdown, he said at last, on the night your fiancé married your cousin, what brings you out here alone? For a moment, Eleanor could not find her voice. The question lingered between them, gentler than it might have been from any other man of his rank. Most would have used it as an opening for curiosity, thinly veiled as gossip. From the Duke of Ravensfield, it sounded almost like concern. Almost. I was warm, she said at last, focusing on the flickering lantern nearest them. The ballroom is crowded. Indeed, he replied. Crowded with congratulations, toasts, smiles. He paused as if measuring his next words. And yet, you are not among them, she swallowed. You observe a great deal, Your Grace. It is the only amusement left to a man who has attended far too many. Balls, he said dryly. Forgive me, I do not mean to intrude. I merely thought, he broke off, studying her face more closely. Eleanor realized with a start that her composure, so carefully arranged, must be thinner than she believed. A single careless word, and it would shatter. You thought what, Your Grace? She asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know. That you looked, he said slowly, rather like someone who has been asked to applaud at her own execution. A sound escaped her then, halfway between a laugh and a sob. Mortified, she turned her face away. I am being foolish, she murmured. It is not so very tragic as all that. No one has died. In my experience, he said quietly, there are losses that can feel a great deal like a death, even when everyone concerned remains inconveniently alive. The truth of it struck her so precisely that she had to grip the cold stone of the balustrade. You are unexpected, Your Grace, she managed. So I am frequently told. Something in his tone shifted, softened. Miss Ashdown, if I am correct in assuming that the gentleman presently accepting felicitations with your cousin is the same gentleman who once paid you particular attentions, you have my sympathies. Eleanor went still. How did you? London listens, he said simply. More often than it thinks. Less often than it understands. Shame flared hot along her throat. They are all talking of me then. Some are, he acknowledged. Most are merely pleased to have a fresh anecdote to soften their soup. The tongue forgets soon enough. His gaze held hers. But that does not mean you are obliged to pretend you feel nothing tonight. Eleanor drew herself up a little. I must pretend, Your Grace, for my family's sake. Ah, his eyes darkened, as if the word had struck a chord. Duty. The music inside swelled, a new waltz beginning. Through the door, Eleanor could see glimpses of the dancers swirling past, Marianne's ivory skirts, Edmund's dark coat, her aunt's delighted smile as she spoke to some titled guest. It was as if an invisible wall stood between that world and this quiet stretch of terrace. I promised myself I would not cry, Eleanor said softly. It seemed indecent. He has chosen. She has accepted. We all must live with the arrangement that best serves our households. And where in that tidy accounting? The Duke asked. Do you appear, Miss Ashdown? She hesitated. I do not, I think. Not any longer. He studied her for a moment, as if committing her answer to memory. Then, to her surprise, he shrugged out of his evening coat. What are you? You are shivering, he said. Whatever else we allow society to rearrange, we need not add a chill to your troubles. Before she could protest, he had laid the coat gently around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of starch, clean wool, and some subtle, unfamiliar spice. The gesture was shockingly intimate, and yet his hands did not linger. He stepped back at once, putting a respectable distance between them. You must not, she whispered. If someone sees, he said calmly, they will suppose that I found a distressed lady on the verge of fainting and behaved with precisely the kind of gallantry your aunt will praise in the morning. A faint smile touched his mouth. Unless you would prefer I call a footman and half the ballroom as witnesses? She could not help it. She laughed, a small, startled sound that loosened something tight in her chest. No, she said. No footman. Then allow me this minor rebellion, he replied. I am told I am quite impossible. It would be a pity not to live up to expectation now and then. Silence fell between them. but it was no longer sharp and brittle. Eleanor felt strangely safer wrapped in his coat than she had all evening in her own home. "Do you often hide on terraces at balls, Your Grace?" she asked, attempting lightness. "Hide?" His brows lifted. "I would call it strategic retreat. The alternative is listening to Lady Weatherby describe her cats." Again, his gaze warmed. "And tonight it appears my cowardice has enjoyed an unexpected reward." "A reward?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. "Conversation with a woman who does not simper or flatter," he said. "A rare thing, Miss Ashdown." Her cheeks heated. "You have known me barely 5 minutes. I might be a dreadful flatterer given sufficient time." "I am willing to risk it," he murmured. The terrace door swung open then, and a familiar sharp voice cut through the night. "Eleanor, there you are. I have been searching—" Lady Agatha broke off as she registered the scene, her niece wrapped in the Duke of Ravensfield's coat, standing far too close to the most desired bachelor in England. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then Lady Agatha's eyes widened and something like calculation flickered there, quick and bright. "Your Grace," she said, recovering herself with astonishing speed. "What an unexpected pleasure. I hope my niece has not been detaining you unconscionably." The Duke inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "On the contrary, Lady Agatha," he said. "I was just about to ask Miss Ashdown a question that may very well change the course of her evening." For a heartbeat, Eleanor forgot how to breathe. Lady Agatha's hand tightened on her arm, her fan fluttering in agitated little bursts. "A question, Your Grace?" she repeated, her tone all sweet curiosity and sharpened expectation. The Duke's gaze did not leave Eleanor's face. "Yes," he said calmly. "I was about to ask Miss Ashdown if she would do me the honor of the next dance." The world seemed to tilt. "The next—" Eleanor's voice came out faint. "Your Grace, What an excellent notion," Lady Agatha cut in, her eyes shining with sudden delight. "Eleanor would be enchanted. Wouldn't you, my dear?" Her aunt's fingers pressed a firm warning into her sleeve. Eleanor could almost hear the unspoken command. "Do not be foolish. This is the Duke of Ravensfield, the most desired bachelor in England, the man every ambitious mamma in London watched from behind her fan, the one man who had until this moment shown a remarkable disinterest in matrimonial entanglements. He was still watching her, plainly waiting for her answer, as if Lady Agatha's interruption had never happened. Eleanor's heart pounded. "If you are quite sure, Your Grace," she said at last, her voice steadier than she felt, "I would be honored." A flicker of something, approval perhaps, touched his expression. "Then it is settled," he said. "Lady Agatha, may I borrow your niece for a few moments? I promise to return her with an unimpeachable reputation." "I should hope so," Lady Agatha said, almost faint with triumph. "Do allow me a moment to inform the musicians that His Grace of Ravensfield is about to grace the floor. They will wish to choose something appropriately memorable." As she swept back into the ballroom, positively vibrating with excitement, Eleanor turned to the Duke. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly. "On the contrary," he replied, offering his arm. "I find I did." She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her gloved hand on his sleeve. The coat he had given her slipped more securely around her shoulders, its weight both anchoring and strangely protective. When they stepped through the terrace doors, conversation near the entrance faltered. A visible ripple passed through the nearest group of guests as they took in the sight. Eleanor Ashdown, formerly jilted, wrapped in the Duke of Ravensfield's coat and walking at his side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Eleanor felt every gaze like a touch upon her skin. Her spine wanted to curl under the scrutiny. Instead, she made herself stand taller. If she was to be the subject of talk, she would at least give them something worth repeating. "Do you enjoy causing a sensation, Your Grace?" she asked under her breath. "Only on select occasions," he answered, "and only when it serves a purpose." "What purpose could this possibly serve?" He glanced down at her. "You will tell me by the end of the dance whether it has made your night more bearable. If not, I shall consider my experiment a failure and retreat to the card room in disgrace." She surprised herself by smiling. "Very well. We shall measure the success of your efforts scientifically." The musicians, already alerted by Lady Agatha, struck up a waltz, rich and full. As the Duke led her to the center of the floor, the crowd parted around them as if by instinct. Eleanor caught sight of Edmund and Marianne near the far end of the room, both turning toward the commotion. For the first time that evening, Edmund's composure slipped. His brows drew together, his gaze sharpening as it landed on Eleanor's hand resting on the Duke's arm. Marianne's fingers tightened on her fan, her smile wavering just slightly. The Duke seemed not to notice, or chose not to. "Miss Ashdown," he said, turning to face her as they took their places, "if at any point during this dance you wish to flee, you have only to say the word. I am told I am an excellent accomplice in escape attempts. You mean to help me run away from my own ball?" she murmured. If necessary, he replied, though I suspect you are stronger than you know. Before she could think of an answer, the dance began. His hand settled at her waist with practiced ease, his other hand enclosing hers. The contact sent a jolt through her. Not romantic lightning, not yet, but something like the sudden awareness of being solidly, unquestionably held after too long standing alone. He was a skilled dancer. That much was immediately clear. He guided her through the opening turns with unhurried confidence, as though the swirling room and watching eyes were of no consequence at all. "Look at me," he said quietly. She, startled. "Your Grace, if you watch the room, you will drown in it," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "Watch me instead. It requires less effort." Almost against her will, her gaze lifted to his. The noise mingled into a distant hum. The chandeliers, the guests, even Edmund and Marianne receded to the edges of her awareness. "That is better," he said, satisfaction softening his features. "Now, tell me what you would be doing tonight if..." There were no expectations, no duty, no watchful eyes. The question caught her off guard. "I do not know." "Think," he pressed gently. She considered. "I would be in the library," she said slowly, "with a book and a fire, and no one asking why I am not dancing." "A dangerous wish," he said. "I have long suspected libraries to be the truest rival I possess in London." This drew a genuine laugh from her. "You believe yourself in competition with books, Your Grace?" "I have lost to them before," he said gravely. "My sister has been known to forget my existence when in the presence of a promising novel." "You have a sister?" Eleanor asked, seizing on the new piece of him he had revealed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I had," he corrected softly. Regret flickered through her. "Forgive me. I did not mean to press." "You did not," he said. "I offered the information freely. I merely find I am out of practice speaking of certain matters." They turned, stepping neatly around another couple. She realized with a start that the music was carrying them in a wide, sweeping circle that placed them slowly, inexorably, closer to Edmund and Marianne. As they approached, Eleanor felt her chest constrict. Edmund's eyes were fixed on her now, searching, puzzled, perhaps a little wounded? She could not tell, and the uncertainty pricked at her. "That look," the Duke murmured. "Does it trouble you still?" She knew at once which look he meant. "Yes," she admitted, "though I wish it did not." "Then perhaps," he said, his voice low and steady, "we ought to give him something definitive to see rather than leaving him to wonder." "Something definitive," she repeated faintly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he guided her through the next turn with such controlled grace that a soft murmur of appreciation rippled outward from the watching crowd. When they came out of the turn, they were almost directly before Edmund and Marianne. "Miss Ashdown," the Duke said then, his gaze still on hers, "I must ask you a question, and I warn you the answer will not only determine the success of my evening, it may very well set the course of the rest of your season." Eleanor's pulse beat so loudly in her ears, she wondered if the orchestra could hear it. "What kind of question could possibly do all that, Your Grace?" and she asked, struggling for composure. They turned in another slow revolution, skirts whispering, candlelight catching on the Duke's dark hair. His hand at her waist remained steady, his gaze intent as if the rest of the ballroom had ceased to exist. "One that only you may answer," he said quietly. "Tell me, Miss Ashdown, for the remainder of this season, do you wish to vanish or to be seen?" She blinked. "Seen," she repeated. He inclined his head almost imperceptibly toward Edmund and Marianne. "You stand at a crossroads whether you wished it or not. Society will decide a story about you. My question is simple. Will you allow them to choose it for you, or will you choose it yourself?" The words sank into her like stones into water, ripples spreading through thoughts she had not yet dared to shape. "I do not see how my choice can matter," she said. "The tale has already been told. Jilted girl, dutiful cousin, pragmatic arrangement. I am merely the casualty." His fingers closed slightly more firmly around hers. "You are not a casualty," he said, so low only she could hear. "You are a woman who has been badly served by people who should have known better. That is not the sum of you, not unless you permit it." Their path through the dance brought them almost within a few steps of Edmund and Marianne now. Eleanor saw Edmund straighten, his expression tightening at the edges. Marianne's smile grew more brittle, her eyes wide and too bright. "If I say I wish to vanish," Eleanor asked, her throat tight, "then I shall find a way to help you slip quietly from the room, and I will ensure the gossips have little to chew on," he replied. "But if you say you wish to be seen..." then I will make very certain that when London looks at you it does not see pity. Her breath caught. You cannot promise that. I can promise that no one will dare voice it within my hearing, he said, a flash of steel beneath the calm. And that is a beginning. They turned again. The music swelled. Eleanor thought of disappearing, of slipping upstairs, removing her gown, packing her trunk, and being gone before dawn. It was a tempting vision. No more stairs, no more whispers, no more pretending. But then another memory rose. Her aunt's sharp voice, her father's tired eyes, Marianne's tremulous apology, Edmund's calm, careful explanation that his duty must come first. At every turn, someone else had decided what Eleanor must accept. Her fingers tightened around the Duke's. I am so very tired of being arranged, she whispered. Yes, he said simply. So, what do you choose? The next step would carry them directly past Edmund and Marianne. Eleanor felt the moment cresting like a wave. I choose, she heard herself say, to be seen. Something eased in the Duke's face, like a man who had feared the wrong answer for reasons he had not admitted even to himself. Then forgive me in advance, Miss Ashdown, he murmured, a hint of wryness returning to his tone, for what I am about to do. Before she could ask what he meant, the figure of the dance brought them face to face with the newly married couple. Miss Ashdown, Edmund began, his voice carefully courteous. Your Grace, he inclined his head to Ravensfield. London will be quite astonished to see you on the floor tonight. Let it be astonished, the Duke said, perfectly polite. It is a tedious creature, one must occasionally rouse it. Marianne gave a quick, nervous laugh. We are so pleased to see you enjoying the evening. Eleanor, she said, her hand tightening on Edmund's arm, I had worried you might feel overwhelmed. I have had excellent assistance, Eleanor replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The Duke nodded once, as though she had passed some unseen test. Miss Ashdown is a remarkably composed partner, he said. I find myself in danger of enjoying this ball. Edmund's gaze sharpened. Indeed, he said. I had not realized you were acquainted. We were not, the Duke answered, until tonight. I have found the oversight regrettable. The words were mild. The implication was not. Edmund's jaw flexed. I see, he said. Eleanor, I trust you are, well? It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of all that had gone unsaid between them. She felt absurdly as though her answer might break something fragile inside her. I am, she replied, meeting his eyes without flinching, as well as I have need to be. A flicker of something, regret, annoyance, crossed his face. Marianne, perhaps sensing the shift, leaned forward, eyes shining. We are hoping you and I will be as close as ever, cousin, she said quickly. Nothing between us need change. We are family. For an instant, Eleanor saw beneath the sweetness, not malice, but fear. Fear that Eleanor's presence might cast an unwelcome shadow over Marianne's. Shining new happiness, she felt something in herself settle. Of course we are family, Eleanor said gently, and family, as we have seen, is adept at adjusting. Her lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. You need not concern yourself on my account, Marianne. I shall manage. The Duke's hand at her waist moved, guiding her smoothly as the dance carried them past. Well answered, he murmured, just for her. As they turned away, Eleanor glimpsed Edmund's expression one last time. Confusion battled with something darker, something like the first sting of loss. She felt the old ache rise, and to her astonishment, found it no longer quite so large. When the waltz finally ended, applause rippled through the room. Eleanor realized with a curious jolt that they had been surrounded the entire time by watchful eyes and listening ears, and yet, for those moments, it had felt as though only the two of them existed. The Duke bowed over her hand, his gaze holding hers. Well, Miss Ashdown, he asked softly, has your evening improved? Yes, she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Yes, it has. Good. His mouth curved. Then my experiment is, for the moment, a success. He stepped back slightly then, as if preparing to release her into the crowd, but did not. Instead, his expression turned a shade more serious. Understand, he continued more quietly, that London will not forget this dance soon. You have chosen to be seen. There will be consequences. Her pulse quickened. What sort of consequences? He studied her, as if measuring how far he might go. Whispers, curiosity, invitations that might not otherwise have arrived. Some will assume I am merely amusing myself. Others, his eyes darkened, others will decide, very quickly, that Eleanor Ashdown is no longer a safe object of pity, but a subject of interest. And you? She asked before she could stop herself. What will you decide, Your Grace? His answer was brief, but it wrapped around her like a promise and a warning all at once. I am not yet finished with my questions, he said, and I rarely abandon a conversation that interests me. Eleanor did not quite remember how the remainder of the ball passed. There were, She supposed other dances. At least 2 gentlemen bowed and requested the honor. Emboldened by the spectacle of her waltz with the Duke, she found herself on the arm of Mr. Caldwell for a cotillion, then Mr. Penhurst for a reel. Both were perfectly polite, perfectly forgettable. When she tried later to recall their faces, all she could see were dark grey eyes that missed very little, and a faint, wry smile that promised trouble of a very particular sort. The Duke did not claim another dance, though she sensed him at the edges of the room once or twice. Once she looked up from a line of figures in the reel and found him across the ballroom, engaged in conversation with an older gentleman. Even from that distance she felt the weight of his brief glance, the deliberate dip of his head, as if to say, "I see you still." It was a strange thing to feel seen and not devoured by it. When at last the guests began to depart in a rustle of silk and a clatter of carriages, Eleanor found herself cornered near the refreshment table by Lady Agatha. "Well," her aunt breathed, cheeks flushed and eyes alight. "Well, you foolish, blessed child. If I had known you possessed such sense, I would have bullied you less." Eleanor blinked. "Sense, aunt? Do not play the innocent with me," Lady Agatha said, though her tone held more glee than reproach. "The Duke of Ravensfield, on your very first night as a not-bride, do you have any idea what you have accomplished?" "Nothing at all," Eleanor said truthfully. "I have done nothing, aunt. He asked me to dance." "And you accepted?" Lady Agatha replied, gracefully, with your head held high. The entire room saw it. "Mark my words, child, by tomorrow afternoon every drawing-room in Mayfair will be buzzing." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "I find that thought less comforting than you imagine." "Nonsense. This is precisely what you require, a new narrative." Lady Agatha snapped her fan shut. "We will have callers. Do try not to be melancholy. It will frighten them." "I am not a shop display, aunt," Eleanor said softly. "Of course you are not," her aunt replied, patting her cheek absently. "But if you wish to be chosen, you must be seen. And tonight, my dear, you have been seen indeed." The key words echoing the Duke's earlier question sent a faint shiver along Eleanor's spine. By the time the last of the guests had gone, her feet ached, her cheeks throbbed from enforced smiles, and her head hummed with too many impressions. She longed only for quiet. Her father found her at the foot of the staircase, his cravat loosened, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen in public before. "Eleanor," Mr. Ashdown said, his voice rough, with fatigue. "A word, if you please." She dismissed the hovering maid and followed him into his study. The room smelled of ink and old leather, and the faint tang of brandy. Papers lay in small, haphazard stacks on the desk, testimony to recent anxieties. "I will not keep you long," he said, sinking into his chair. Deep lines bracketed his mouth. "You look worn out. It has been a trying day." "That is an elegant understatement, Papa," she answered gently. He gave a humorless chuckle. "You have borne it well. Better than I deserve to ask of you." He hesitated, then met her gaze. "I am sorry, Ellie." He had not called her that since she was a girl. The sound of it softened something in her chest. "I know," she said. "Truly I do. You did what you believed necessary." "Necessary is a poor comfort," he murmured. His eyes lingered on her face, then shifted past her shoulder, as if he could not quite bear what he might see there. "I am told Ravensfield danced with you." "Yes," Eleanor said carefully. "Once?" "Once," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. "Even once is something. More than something. It seems," he exhaled, "it seems our fortunes may not be entirely hopeless." Eleanor felt an old familiar resentment stir, the knowledge that her heart and future were measured in terms of fortunes and debts and alliances. Yet she could not bring herself to lash out. He looked too tired. "You must not place your hopes anywhere they will be wounded again, Papa," she said quietly. Edmund's choice was warning enough. "Edmund was a debt paid," her father said, a trace of bitterness beneath the weariness. "Ravensfield is something else entirely." She frowned. "You know him?" "Only by reputation." He reached for a sheaf of papers, then seemed to think better of it, and set them aside. "Go and rest, child. We will speak of all this another day. Nothing is decided yet." "Nothing is decided." The words chased her up the stairs. In her bedchamber, Betsy unpinned her hair and eased her out of the pale blue gown. When at last Eleanor was alone, wrapped in her nightgown with the bedclothes pulled around her, she lay staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The ball replayed itself in fragments. Edmund's impassive profile at the altar, Marianne's shining eyes, Lady Agatha's delighted calculation, the weight of a dark blue coat settling over her shoulders, a low voice asking, "Do you wish to vanish or to be seen?" "You are a ridiculous man," she whispered into the dimness, though she was not entirely sure whether she meant Edmund or the Duke. Sleep came fitfully. Morning brought proof, as Lady Agatha had predicted, that London wasted no time. By 10 o'clock, the first calling card arrived. By 11 there were 4. At 1:30, a footman knocked on the drawing-room door with an expression that hovered between awe and panic. "Miss Ashdown," he announced, "there is a carriage outside bearing the Ravensfield crest. His Grace has sent in his card." The room seemed to tilt again just as it had the night before. Lady Agatha sat up straighter, almost incandescent. "The Duke of Ravensfield," she breathed. "Here." This morning, Eleanor's teacup rattled in its saucer. "He cannot be calling on me," she said, the protest weak even to her own ears. Her aunt's eyes gleamed. "Oh, my dear, I believe that is precisely what he is doing." For a moment, no one in the drawing-room seemed to breathe. Lady Agatha's hand fluttered to her throat. "Show His Grace in at once," she told the footman, her voice wobbling between command and disbelief. "And see that Mrs. Collins brings fresh tea. No, bring the good tea, the Darjeeling." As the footman vanished, Lady Agatha turned to Eleanor. "Stand up," she hissed, already rising herself. "You are slouching." "No, not there. By the window. The light is better, and for heaven's sake stop clutching your handkerchief as though it were a lifeline." "It feels rather like one," Eleanor murmured, but she did as she was told, smoothing her skirts and moving to the indicated spot. Her heart beat a wild tattoo against her ribs. Her father entered from the corridor that led to his study, just as the door to the hall opened again. "Ravensfield?" Mr. Ashdown asked quietly. "The very same," Lady Agatha whispered, every line of her body vibrating with tension. The Duke of Ravensfield stepped into the room with an ease that suggested this was merely another polite call in a long list of obligations. Yet his gaze, when it swept the drawing-room, did not linger on the polished furniture or the arrangement of flowers that Lady Agatha had clearly fussed over. It found Eleanor at once. "Lady Agatha, Mr. Ashdown," he bowed with practiced grace. "I trust I find you well after your exertions last night." "Well enough, Your Grace, well enough," Lady Agatha gushed. "We are honoured, deeply honoured by your visit." "The honour is mine," he said, and Eleanor could not tell whether he meant it in the practiced way of society or in some narrower, more pointed fashion. "Your ball was most memorable." He turned slightly then, including her with deliberate courtesy. "Miss Ashdown, Your Grace," she managed, dipping into a curtsy. Her fingers, she noted with faint detachment, were perfectly steady. That seemed unjust, considering the chaos in her chest. "Pray be seated," Mr. Ashdown said, recovering himself enough to wave a hand toward the chairs near the hearth. "We are of course at your disposal." The Duke chose an armchair position so that, when Eleanor sat opposite, he could speak to her without excluding her aunt or father. It was a careful choice, she thought, considered, measured. "I hope you will forgive the early hour," he said when they were all settled. "I have long held a prejudice in favor of morning calls. The day grows noisier as it goes on. One's thoughts grow crowded with it." "A very sensible prejudice," Mr. Ashdown replied, with a glance at Eleanor that said, "He speaks your language, child." Lady Agatha poured tea with uncharacteristic care, as though the stability of the pot might affect the stability of their fortunes. "I wished first," the Duke continued, accepting a cup, "to offer my thanks to Miss Ashdown for her company last evening." His gaze touched hers briefly. "I am aware that I intruded upon a difficult night. I am grateful nonetheless." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "It is I who ought to thank you, Your Grace," she said. "You altered the shape of the evening for me." "Did I?" A hint of satisfaction glimmered beneath his calm. "Then I shall take that as justification for what some may call recklessness." Lady Agatha gave a little shrill laugh. "Recklessness? Oh, Your Grace, I assure you." He lifted a hand, the gesture polite but decisive. "I am well aware of my reputation, Lady Agatha. It is of no particular interest to me this morning." Eleanor's father, who had been watching with an expression that mixed curiosity and dread, leaned forward. "May I ask plainly, Your Grace," Mr. Ashdown said, "what prompted you to call? If it is merely courtesy after last night's dance, we are duly honoured and will treasure the memory." The Duke rested his teacup in its saucer, turning it once between long fingers. Eleanor noticed the faint scar along his knuckle, white against his skin. It looked old, as if earned in some long-forgotten accident. "I came," he said at last, "because I dislike unfinished conversations." Silence met this. "Miss Ashdown and I spoke yesterday of choices," he went on, his gaze resting on her now, "of vanishing and being seen. I find myself," he paused, searching for a word, "curious whether her choice remains the same in daylight." Eleanor's mouth went unexpectedly dry. Lady Agatha looked from one to the other, mystified. "I do not quite follow, Your Grace." "You need not," he said, not unkindly. "It is a question only Miss Ashdown can answer." answer. He waited, and in the quiet Eleanor could hear the ticking of the mantel clock, the faint rattle of carriage wheels outside, the small, almost inaudible hitch in her father's breathing. Last night, with candlelight and music wrapping around her, it had been easier to be brave. Morning made everything feel more solid, more consequential. Yet when she searched herself, she found that the answer had not changed. "I have no wish to vanish," she said, surprised by the calm in her own voice. "Not anymore." A slow nod, as if he had expected no less. "Then, with your father's permission," the Duke said, turning now to Mr. Ashdown, "I should like to be counted among those who see her." Mr. Ashdown stared. "You mean to call again, Your Grace?" "If I am welcome," Ravensfield replied, "and if Miss Ashdown does not object, I would propose that we be seen together in Hyde Park tomorrow. The weather is expected to be fair, and the row is less tedious when one has something worth talking of." Lady Agatha made a strangled sound somewhere between a squeak and a prayer. "A drive in the park," she whispered. "With Your Grace." Eleanor's heartbeat thudded in her ears. Such an outing would not go unnoticed. It was one thing to share a single dance in the charged atmosphere of her own ball, another entirely to be seen in public, in daylight by half of London, on the arm of the most sought-after Duke. Her father's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. "It is a generous offer, Your Grace," he said, slowly. "But I must ask, do you understand what such attentions will signify? To others, and to my daughter." The Duke's eyes softened, though the steel beneath remained. "I understand very well, Mr. Ashdown," he said. "I am not in the habit of bestowing my name upon rumours without intention." His gaze returned to Eleanor, steady and questioning. "The decision, however," he added, "ought not to be mine at all. Miss Ashdown, will you drive with me tomorrow?" For a long moment no one spoke. Eleanor felt three sets of eyes upon her, her aunt's round with dazzled hope, her father's shadowed with worry, and the Duke's steady, waiting, as though he truly meant what he had said, that the decision belonged to her. "A drive in the park," Lady Agatha whispered again as if tasting the words, "with His Grace of Ravensfield." "Eleanor, do not—" "Aunt," Eleanor said gently, without looking away from the Duke. "Please." Lady Agatha snapped her mouth shut, astonished into silence. Eleanor drew a breath. It felt like standing at the edge of the terrace all over again, with the night stretching wide before her, and only her own courage to decide whether she stepped forward or retreated. "If I agree," she said slowly, "it must not be as a performance, Your Grace. I will not pretend to be what I am not, merely to give London something new to chatter about." His mouth curved, faint and real. "I should not dare ask it of you, Miss Ashdown. I have had my fill of performances. I am not seeking an actress." "What are you seeking, then?" she asked, before she could think better of it. The question seemed to surprise him as much as herself. For an instant, something unguarded crossed his features, weariness perhaps, twined with an almost boyish bemusement. "I am not entirely certain," he admitted. "I only know that for the first time in many months, I found myself last night in conversation with someone who did not treat me as a prize to be won or a threat to be managed. I would like to see what else we might say to one another, if given more than a single waltz." The simplicity of it disarmed her. "Eleanor," her father said quietly, "you need not feel obliged. You have endured enough obligations of late." She turned to him, the set of his shoulders, the grey at his temples, the burden of choices he had made, choices that had cost her so much, looked back at her. "Papa," she said softly, "I do not feel obliged." Returning her gaze to the Duke, she lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I will drive with you tomorrow." Relief flickered in Lady Agatha's eyes. Something like approval strengthened in her father's. But it was the Duke's expression that held her. Not triumph, not smugness, only that intent curiosity, deepening as if she had just opened a door he had hoped she would. "Then I am honored," he said simply. "I shall call for you at 11, if that suits." "It does," Mr. Ashdown answered before Eleanor could speak. "You will find my daughter punctual, Your Grace." "I have no doubt," Ravensfield replied, rising. "Thank you for your hospitality this morning. I will not trespass on your time further." There were formalities then, bows, curtsies, careful phrases, but as he took his leave he paused just inside the doorway and glanced back at Eleanor. "Miss Ashdown," he said, his tone light but his eyes not light at all, "I suggest you bring a shawl tomorrow. The wind on the row has its own ideas, and I have no wish to sacrifice another coat so soon." The corners of her mouth lifted almost against her will. "I shall remember, Your Grace." When he had gone, the silence he left behind was thick enough to touch. Lady Agatha was the first to break it. "A shawl," she repeated faintly, as if he were discussing the weather, as if men like that call every day to inquire whether one is inclined to be seen in the park. Aggie, Mr. Ashdown said warningly, though there was a note of wonder beneath the caution. She rounded on him. Do you not understand? Eleanor, child, do you not see? A dance, a morning call, a drive in the park. This is not merely politeness. The Duke is... He is complicated, Eleanor suggested. Lady Agatha made an impatient sound. Pursuing you. The words struck the air like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor felt the ripples all the way down to her bones. Let us not outrun ourselves, Mr. Ashdown said, though his eyes were brighter than before. Whatever His Grace intends, we would be wise to proceed with caution. Caution, yes, Lady Agatha conceded, but also with a good dressmaker. Eleanor, we must see about your pelisse at once. The green one will do. It sets off your eyes. Oh, and your bonnet. Where is that wretched girl with the hat boxes? Betsy. As her aunt bustled from the room in a flurry of plans, Eleanor remained where she was, one hand resting lightly on the back of the nearest chair. Her father crossed to her, his voice low. Are you certain, Ellie? He asked. The attention of a man like Ravensfield can burn as easily as it warms. I know, she said, thinking of the way the ballroom had turned when they stepped onto the floor, the weight of all those eyes. But last night, when he offered me that choice, vanish or be seen, I answered without thinking. This morning I had time to think, and my answer did not change. He studied her, some new respect mingling with his concern. Your mother would have been proud of you, he murmured. She always said you had more courage than you believed. The mention of her mother, gone these 6 years, softened the hard edges of the day. Then let us see, Eleanor said quietly, what my courage is worth in the light of morning. She did not sleep much that night either, but when the Ravensfield crest appeared again on a carriage the next day, sleek and dark against the pale spring sky, her hands did not tremble as Betsy tied the ribbons of her bonnet. Eleanor's fingers curled against the edge of the seat. Not entirely chance, she repeated, keeping her voice low. What do you mean? The Duke watched the road ahead for a few heartbeats longer, as if weighing how much to say. Sunlight slipped through the carriage windows, tracing a pale line across his cheekbone and the strong angle of his jaw. Do you recall, he said, at Felast, a school in Bath called St. Winifred's? She blinked. Of course, I spent 2 winters there before my mother became ill. My sister spent 3, he answered. Her name, as I told you, was Julia. Eleanor sifted through old memories, chilly mornings, ink-stained fingers, laughter in crowded dormitories. The faces blurred together, girls in white pinafores, braids and ribbons, and whispered secrets under blankets. I am not sure I remember. You would not, he said, a faint smile touching his mouth. Julia was 2 years younger. You would have been one of the grand older girls who walked as if the whole world were already watching. I most certainly did not, Eleanor protested, startled. You did, he said quietly, at least according to her letters. Her breath caught. Her letters, he nodded once. Shortly before she fell ill, she wrote of a girl at school she admired. I remember her very phrases. She is not the prettiest, Julia wrote, though she is very pretty when she laughs, but she is the only one who does not laugh when the others mock the quiet girl with the crooked teeth. She pretends not to notice, but she always sits beside her at meals. Heat rose along Eleanor's throat. Many girls must have done the same. No, he said, they did not. I know because Julia wrote of how she tried to follow your example and failed half the time. She was painfully honest about her own cowardice. But how do you know she meant me? Eleanor asked, heart skittering. There must have been dozens. She named you, he replied, his gaze steady. In another letter, Eleanor Ashdown, she wrote, I hope she never marries a stupid man. She would be wasted on one. Eleanor stared at him. The clamour of the park receded. The carriage seemed suddenly smaller, filled not only with the 2 of them, but with the ghost of a laughing girl she barely remembered, and a sister who no longer lived. I had no idea, she whispered. We were not friends, not as such. I do not even remember speaking more than a few times. You lent her a book, he said, a ridiculous novel about a girl who insisted on rescuing herself. She hid it under her pillow until the headmistress confiscated it. The corner of his mouth quirked. Julia was furious on your behalf for weeks. Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. That sounds like me, she admitted, and like your sister, if she truly wrote such things to you. She did, he said. After she died, I could not bear to read her letters for a long time. When I finally did, your name was there. It stayed with me. She swallowed, looking down at her gloved hands. And so when you heard of my circumstances, when I heard, he said quietly, that the Miss Ashdown, whose name my sister had once underlined twice for emphasis, had been displaced in so public and graceless a fashion, I found myself Interested. Interested, she repeated, tasting the word, as one might be interested in a curiosity. You do me less credit than I deserve, he said, though there was no heat in the correction. I resented, on your behalf and on Julia's, that someone she admired should be treated as a convenient pawn. So yes, I went to the ball last night with the intention of seeing you for myself. When I saw you flee the room, I followed. That much, Miss Ashdown, was entirely deliberate. Eleanor leaned back against the seat, mind whirling. So I was a project, she murmured, a subject of study, an unfinished note in your sister's letters. His jaw tightened. No, he said. You were a question I had carried with me for 3 years without realizing it. Last night, for the first time, I had an opportunity to ask it. What question? Whether Julia had been right about you, he answered simply. Whether you would still stand straight when the world invited you to crumple. Whether the girl who would not laugh at cruelty had become a woman who would accept it in silence. Eleanor stared at him, anger and something dangerously like gratitude warring in her chest. And what did you decide? She asked. Last night, he considered. I decided the world was about to discover it had chosen the wrong person to pity. The carriage rolled on. Outside, riders trotted past, hats tipping, eyes cutting sideways toward the Ravensfield crest. Inside, the air felt charged, as if a storm threatened somewhere just beyond sight. You must see, she said at last, how it feels to hear that your sudden attentions are not too spontaneous, that you came to my house armed with old stories about the girl I once was. I do see, he replied quietly, and you have every right to mistrust it. If it eases you, I will say this plainly. Whatever curiosity first brought me to that terrace, it is not what brought me to your drawing room this morning, or to this carriage. His gaze held hers, steady as a vow. What brought you here then? She asked, her voice barely above the creak of the wheels. He hesitated, only a heartbeat. You did, he said. The woman who chose to be seen when hiding would have been simpler. The woman who told her cousin, with exquisite politeness, that she would manage, when every eye in the room was waiting for her to break. Her throat tightened. Do not make me more heroic than I am, she said. You heard my father speak of debts. I have learned obedience too well. Perhaps I simply do not know how to vanish properly. He smiled, but it was a small, rueful thing. If you are obedient, Miss Ashdown, then I am a model of moderation, which, as London will happily attest, I am not. Another carriage passed close by. Eleanor caught a chorus of whispers, fragments of their names. Ravensfield, Miss Ashdown, the ball, before the distance swallowed them. Listen, he said softly. Already the story is changing. Into what? She asked. That is the part we write, he answered. If you will allow me to hold the pen beside you. Her heart gave one startled, painful thud. She opened her mouth, uncertain what she meant to say, when the carriage began to slow. We will stop here for a short turn on foot, he said, as if the last few minutes had been nothing more than a polite exchange about the weather. It will give the gossips a clearer view, and I find I prefer conversations in motion. A walk, she echoed faintly. If you are willing. He lifted a brow, waiting. Eleanor looked through the window at the path ahead, already dotted with promenading couples. She could almost feel the weight of their curiosity gathering, like a pressure in the air. Then she thought of Julia's underlined letters, of the girl she had been at St. Winifred's, lending forbidden novels and offering quiet seats at noisy tables. Very well, that girl said in some deep place within her. Let us see if we still know how to stand. She drew a breath. Yes, she said, I am willing. The carriage came to a halt. As the footman opened the door and the Duke stepped down, Eleanor placed her hand in his, ready to meet whatever this new and watching world chose to see. The air felt different when she stepped down from the carriage, as if the very breeze had paused to watch. The Duke offered his arm. Eleanor placed her hand lightly upon it, acutely aware of how many eyes followed that small, unremarkable gesture. They moved onto the gravel path at an unhurried pace, the carriage rolling ahead to a discreet distance. Conversation around them dipped, then resumed with a new bright undercurrent. Bonnets tilted, monocles gleamed. More than one gentleman nearly walked into a bench while attempting to stare without appearing to do so. It is rather like walking onto a stage, Eleanor murmured. Only no one has been kind enough to give me a script. Consider yourself fortunate, he said. The scripts society writes for women are rarely worth following. And for men? She asked. Equally dull, he replied. Be charming, be tolerably handsome, be rich, and above all, be predictable. I have failed at the last, I am told. I cannot imagine you predictable, Your Grace. Good. It would disappoint Julia terribly if I became so. They walked in silence for a few steps. The gravel crunched softly underfoot. A skylark's song arched high above the murmur of the park. You carry her with you, Eleanor said quietly, in everything. He did not feign misunderstanding. I do, he answered, and before you ask, yes, sometimes it is a weight, but more often It is a reminder. A reminder of what? He hesitated. That I have already outlived the person whose future I was meant to be safeguarding. She looked up at him. You were her guardian? Not in law, in practice. His jaw tightened. Our father was fond of discipline, less fond of presence. When he died, I was 22, Julia 16. I did not yet know how to be anything other than what he had made of me. And what was that? She asked gently, his mouth curved without humor. Cold, efficient, very good at winning and very poor at caring what I won. She thought of the gossip she had heard over the years, little more than rumor. The Duke with the dark eyes and darker temper, the sudden withdrawals from invitations, the whispered story of a broken engagement, not of his making. She had never paid them much mind. Now they folded themselves around his words like a half-remembered cloak. What changed you? She asked. Julia, he said simply. And then, losing Julia. They had reached a quieter stretch of the path, lined with trees just beginning to bud. A cluster of ladies approached, led by a plump, determined woman Eleanor recognized with a jolt. Lady Weatherby, the Duke murmured. Prepare yourself. This one has an arsenal of cats and questions. The older lady descended upon them with a flutter of lace and perfume. Your Grace, Lady Weatherby cried. What a delightful surprise. We see you. So rarely in the park these days, entirely too devoted to your estate, I am sure, and this must be Miss Eleanor Ashdown, the Duke supplied smoothly. Allow me to present Lady Weatherby, who has been attempting to marry me to one of her nieces since I was 19. Your Grace, Lady Weatherby protested, pink with pleasure. How you tease. Miss Ashdown, I am enchanted to make your acquaintance. I had the pleasure of attending your family's ball last night. Such a charming occasion. So many surprises. Eleanor inclined her head. You are very kind, Lady Weatherby. Not half so kind as His Grace, I'm sure, the lady said, her eyes darting between them. To support a young lady in trying circumstances. It speaks so well of your character, Ravensfield, so very well indeed. Let us hope it does not ruin my reputation, he said lightly. Good morning, Lady Weatherby. He moved on, without offering his arm to anyone else. Eleanor felt Lady Weatherby's inquisitive gaze prickling between her shoulder blades like needles. She meant to be complimentary, Eleanor said after a moment. I think. She meant, he replied, to decide which story to carry back to her drawing room. I have given her one. I will take my chances. Ahead, two young women strolled arm in arm, heads bent close. As Eleanor and the Duke approached, their voices drifted back. Always said he would never marry, one whispered. They say he is quite immune. Immune, perhaps, the other replied, but not foolish. If he must be seen with someone, far better a harmless girl just out of some little scandal. It keeps the ambitious mammas at bay. You will see, he will grow tired of her soon enough. Eleanor's steps faltered for a fraction of a second. The Duke's arm tightened beneath her hand, steady as a railing on a ship. They passed the gossiping pair. The ladies fell abruptly silent, cheeks flooding pink. You heard, he said quietly. I did, she answered, her voice even. It is nothing I had not already considered. He stopped then, turning slightly so that they faced one another in the dappled light beneath the budding trees. Miss Ashdown, he said, I cannot control what London chooses to believe, but I can insist upon honesty between us. Ask me what you wish to ask. She searched his face. Will you ever marry? She asked. Or is your intention only to borrow reputations when it suits you? A lesser man might have blustered, flirted, changed the subject. He did none of these things. His gaze did not stray from hers. I do not know if I will marry, he said. There was a time when I thought it my duty, then a time when I thought it a cruelty, to any woman unwise enough to accept. Me. I have watched too many matches made for advantage, too few for kindness. I swore I would not add another cold bargain to that pile. And yet you caught me in public, she said softly. I caught you in public, he agreed, because last night you stood alone when you had every excuse to collapse, because you have a mind that interests me and a courage that unsettles me, because for the first time in years I find myself wanting to know what might happen if I do not run away from the thing that frightens me most. What is that? She whispered. Needing someone, he said, and being needed in return. Her throat closed. The honesty of it struck her harder than any pretty phrase might have. That is not an answer, she managed. Not truly. It does not tell me whether I am an experiment or a possibility. His shoulders lowered slightly, as if he were laying down a piece of armor. You are not an experiment, he said. You are a possibility I did not expect and am clumsy at handling. If that is not enough, if my uncertainty makes me unworthy of your time, say so, and I will leave you in peace. I will see that the gossips grow bored and move on. And if I say it is enough, she asked, hardly daring the words, then, he answered, I will do something I have not done in years. I will allow myself to hope. Before she could reply, a familiar voice called her name from behind. "Eleanor!" She turned to see her father hurrying toward them along the path, hat in hand, color too high in his cheeks. The sight alone was enough to send dread pooling in her stomach. Her father loathed exertion in public. "Papa," she said, "is something wrong?" Mr. Ashdown reached them, slightly breathless. His eyes flicked from his daughter to the Duke and back, full of worry that had nothing to do with society's stares. "I am sorry to intrude, Your Grace," he said, struggling for composure, "but I must speak with my daughter at once. It is a matter of some urgency." The Duke's expression cooled, concern sharpening. "Of course," he said. "Miss Ashdown, shall I wait?" Eleanor looked at her father. His hands, she noticed, were trembling. "No," Mr. Ashdown said quietly. "I fear this concerns you as well, Ravensfield. I have just received a letter from my man of business." He swallowed. "It seems that as of last week a substantial portion of my debts has been purchased by your estate." The world tilted again. Eleanor gripped the Duke's arm without meaning to. "Your Grace," she whispered, the realization crashing over her. "What have you done?" For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sounds of the park went on around them. Hooves, laughter, the distant call of a vendor. But the three of them stood as if encased in glass. The Duke was the first to speak. "Purchased?" he repeated, his voice very quiet. "You are certain, Mr. Ashdown?" Mr. Ashdown fumbled in his coat and produced a folded letter, edges already soft from handling. "My man of business wrote this morning," he said. He had tried to send word before the ball, but apparently there was some delay. The debts once held by Harrow and Finch have been transferred to another party. When he inquired who now holds the notes, he was told, his eyes flicked up, troubled. "He was told they belong to you, Your Grace." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I see." Eleanor's fingers were still wrapped around his sleeve, though she could not recall reaching for him. Slowly, deliberately, she released her hold. "Is it true?" she asked. "Yes," he said. No evasion, no polite misdirection, just that single word, falling like a stone. Her chest felt tight. "When?" 10 days ago. He met her gaze squarely. "Before your cousin's engagement was made public, before your father felt compelled to accept Harrow's kindness." Mr. Ashdown paled. "You interfered in my arrangements with Edmund's family?" "I interfered," the Duke said, "with Harrow and Finch, who were more than happy to hold your debt over your head like a blade. They intended to use it to bind you further, Ashdown. Your daughter, your estate, your choices. I found the prospect distasteful." "So you bought the blade," Eleanor said, the words torn from somewhere deep. "And now you hold it." A pair of riders passed, glancing over with unabashed curiosity. The Duke's eyes flicked briefly to them. "This is not a conversation for the Row," he said quietly. "May we move somewhere less public?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. They walked a little way from the main path, down a smaller track lined with bare-branched trees whose buds swelled with the promise of leaves. The noise of the park dimmed, though she knew they were still visible to any sufficiently determined onlooker. When they stopped, Mr. Ashdown gripped his hat so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Your Grace," he said, "I am grateful for your concern, but this is beyond propriety. To buy a man's debts without his knowledge. Would you have sold them to me, had I asked?" The Duke cut in, not unkindly. Mr. Ashdown faltered. "No," he admitted. "I could not have I would not have wished to place my household under such an obligation." "Precisely," Ravensfield said, "which is why I did not ask. I went to the one place you had no power, your creditors." Eleanor drew a sharp breath. "Do you hear yourself? You speak as if it were a game of chess, as if we are pieces to be shifted where you see fit." His gaze snapped to hers. "You are not a piece, that is the entire point." "Is it?" The trembling in her hands was gone now, replaced by a cold, clear steadiness that frightened her. "Because from where I stand, it seems you have done exactly what every man in my life has done, made decisions about my future without giving me the courtesy of choice." The Duke flinched, barely, as if struck. "I bought those debts," he said, each word measured, because Harrow had already boasted that he would hold them over your father until you bent where he wished. I went to his club. I listened. He spoke of you as if you were a dowry wrapped in muslin. When I discovered how precarious your father's position truly was, I acted as swiftly as I could. "And you did not think," she said, "that perhaps I deserved to know I was being rescued?" He exhaled slowly. "I thought," he said, "that you had already endured enough humiliation without adding the knowledge that yet another man had taken it upon himself to rearrange your life. I meant to set matters in order quietly, then present you with the only thing I believed you truly lacked: time. Freedom from the most pressing threats, so that you might choose without a knife at your throat. Her father stared at him. You intended to forgive the debt? Restructure it, the Duke said. At terms so lenient as to be farcical, eventually perhaps to lose track of certain ledgers, but first I had to get the notes out of Harrow's hands. I would not leave that blade with a man I distrust more than I distrust myself. It should have comforted her, it did not. Do you not see? Eleanor whispered. Whatever your intention, you have put yourself in the same position. Whether ruthless creditor or benevolent guardian, you still hold power. Over us we did not grant you. The wind lifted a strand of her hair. She did not reach to smooth it. The Duke's eyes followed the movement, then returned to her face with something like desperation behind the control. I will not use that power against you, he said. I swear it. You already have, she answered more softly now. Not by demanding payment or threatening ruin, by taking from me the right to decide whether to accept your help at all. A carriage rattled past at the far end of the path. Somewhere a dog barked joyfully. The small ordinary sounds made the sharpness between them feel even more surreal. Ellie, her father said hoarsely, child, His Grace has done us a kindness, however clumsily. Without his intervention we might have lost Ashdown altogether. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. She knew her father spoke truth. She knew too that gratitude and anger could coexist in the same heart and pull it in opposite directions. When she opened her eyes, she found the Duke watching her, as if the next words from her mouth would decide more than the fate of a few pieces of paper. You told me, she said, that you would not use me as a shield or a pawn, that whatever London chose to say you would insist upon honesty between us, and I will, he said. Then be honest now, she replied. If I tell you that I cannot, at this moment, distinguish your protection from control, will you continue to pursue me, or will you give me space to decide who I am when I am not being rescued? Something in his stance eased, though his eyes grew darker. If space is what you need, he said quietly, then I will give it. I will instruct my man of business to put the notes in trust, removed from my direct hand, until you decide what you wish done with them. And I will withdraw from the park, from your drawing room. The words punched the air from her lungs. You would simply disappear, she asked. If I remain visible, he said, every choice you make for the next month will be weighed against my presence. I will not be another pressure upon you. He turned to her father. Ashdown, I will send word when the transfer is complete. Until then, the debts are frozen. No one will call them in. You have my word. Mr. Ashdown looked from one to the other, torn. Your Grace, I did not mean to. You did only what conscience demanded, the Duke said. For that, I cannot fault you. He looked back at Eleanor. For the first time since she had known him, she saw not the most desired Duke in England, but a man stripped of his practiced composure. I did not intend to become another man who arranged your life without asking, he said. If I have, then I am not the ally you need. Her throat burned. I do not know what I need, she whispered. That is the problem. For 5 years I have been nothing but someone's daughter, someone's future wife, someone's obligation. I need to find out who Eleanor is when there is no one else's hand on the scales. He inclined his head once, as if accepting a sentence he had half expected all along. Then I will remove mine, he said. He bowed, properly, formally, as if they stood in the middle of a ballroom rather than on a quiet path with their hearts in disarray. Good day, Miss Ashdown, Mr. Ashdown. Before she could gather an answer, he turned and walked back toward the main path, shoulders straight, stride controlled. People watched him pass, speculation already blooming. He did not look back. Eleanor stood very still, her hand pressed to the ache in her chest, watching until the dark line of his coat blurred among the trees and was gone. The ride home from the park passed in a hush so complete that Eleanor could hear the creak of the carriage springs with painful clarity. Her father sat opposite her, hat on his knees, eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. Every now and then his mouth moved as if he meant to speak, then closed again. At last, as the carriage turned into Ashdown Street, Eleanor broke the silence. You were right to tell me, she said quietly, about the debts, about him. Mr. Ashdown's gaze jerked back to her. I did not mean to tear down what little peace you had found, he replied, but I could not, in good conscience, let you go on believing that Ravensfield's attentions were free of entanglements. Nothing in this world is free of entanglements, she said. That is the lesson I seem doomed to repeat. He winced. Ellie, I am not reproaching you, she added softer, only trying to see clearly. He studied her face for a long moment. Your mother used to say, he murmured, that you saw the world too clearly for your own ease. Perhaps she was right. The carriage jolted to a stop. As they descended and mounted the steps, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of Ashdown House settle around her. Brick and mortar, history and obligation. In the study, the letter from the man of business lay upon the away desk, weighted by an inkstand. Eleanor rested her fingers on its edge. "Will you allow me to be present?" she asked. "When Mr. Green comes?" Her father blinked. "At the meeting? It is all dull numbers, child. Hardly suitable. Numbers have decided my life without my leave," she said. "I should like for once to look them in the eye." After a moment, Mr. Ashdown nodded. "Very well, you shall be there." Mr. Green arrived the next morning, smelling faintly of starch and London fog. He was a small, precise man, with spectacles that slid down his nose whenever he grew animated. "The situation has altered, Miss Ashdown," he began, after the initial courtesies. "His Grace's solicitor has sent fresh instructions." He tapped a sheaf of papers. "The notes are to be placed in a separate trust. No interest is to be demanded this year. No portion of the principal may be called in without at least 3 years' notice, and—" he hesitated, clearly flummoxed. "And the instrument names you, Miss Ashdown, as having the power to direct their eventual disposition once you either marry or attain the age of 8 and 20, whichever comes first." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her teacup. "Me? Yes, miss." Mr. Green squinted at the document. "It is most irregular, generous to the point of absurdity. His Grace has, in effect, tied his own hands and given you the knife with which to cut the cord." Her father exhaled slowly, some tension easing from his shoulders. "He has done as he said," he murmured. "Removed his own hand from the scales. Or moved it, and then removed it," Eleanor thought. The knowledge did not erase her anger, but it complicated it in ways that set her thoughts whirling. Over the next fortnight, London proved that it could indeed grow bored even of a duke. Speculation raged for a week. Had Ravensfield jilted her? Had she jilted him? Was there a secret understanding? Was there a breach? But the man himself withdrew from the row, declined several invitations, and appeared at no balls. Without fresh glimpses to feed upon, gossip turned elsewhere. A viscount caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding with an opera dancer. A baron's daughter who had fainted in a conservatory with suspicious timing. Eleanor attended only a handful of gatherings, enough to show her face, not enough to throw herself back into the whirl. She learned, with some satisfaction, to distinguish men who approached her out of genuine interest from those whose eyes flicked unbidden toward any doorway Ravensfield might have entered. She declined the latter with impeccable politeness. Marianne called one afternoon, all ribbons and bright chatter, Edmund in tow. He looked older than he had a month before. The lines at the corners of his mouth had deepened. "We miss you in society, cousin," Marianne said, pouring tea with slightly too much enthusiasm. "Everyone asks after you. You are quite the topic." "I have had business to attend to with Mr. Green," Eleanor replied. "It seems I possess a head for figures after all. Who would have thought?" Marianne blinked. "Figures? Surely that is dull work for a lady." "It is remarkable," Eleanor said mildly, "how much less dull it becomes when one's future depends upon them." Edmund cleared his throat. "I saw Ravensfield at White's last week," he said abruptly. "He left the card table when I entered. One might almost think he meant to avoid me." "Did you expect him to seek your company?" Eleanor asked, tilting her head. A flush crept up Edmund's neck. "I had thought he and I, were not at odds. I did not anticipate that my arrangements with your father would provoke such hostility. Perhaps he dislikes blades held to throats," Eleanor said, her tone still even metaphorical ones. Marianne's smile faltered. "Eleanor, surely you do not—" "I do not wish to quarrel," Eleanor cut in with unexpected gentleness. "We cannot change what has been done. You are married. My life is no longer tethered to yours in the way we once imagined. We must each learn how to walk without stumbling into the other's path." Marianne's eyes filled suddenly. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," Eleanor said, "but intention does not always lessen the bruise." After they left, she retreated to the library. Sunlight slanted across the shelves, catching dust motes that drifted like lazy stars. On the table lay a small packet that had arrived that morning from a discreet firm of solicitors. Ravensfield's, Mr. Green had said. It contained, in addition to the formal papers about the trust, a single folded sheet in a familiar, unfamiliar hand. The ink had faded. The script was looping and youthful. "My dearest William, I must tell you of a girl at school, Julia's letter." Eleanor sank into a chair and read of her own younger self through the eyes of a stranger, stubborn, kind in small, clumsy ways, unwilling to laugh when others did, lending books she ought not to, insisting that certain cruelties were not in fact just how things are. At the bottom, in a different hand, was a short note. These were hers, her words, about you. "They are yours now if you wish them. I will keep my promise and remain away unless you send word otherwise. Our tears blurred the elegant loops. For the first time since her mother's death, Eleanor allowed herself to weep without worrying who might see. When the storm had passed, she folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest. Who am I when no one is arranging my life? She whispered into the quiet. Perhaps I am still that girl. She rose, smoothed her skirts, and went in search of her father. Papa, she said, standing in the doorway of his study, I have decided. We will sell the London carriage we do not need. We will let the hunting box we never use. We will live more, modestly pay what we can fairly, and trust that the rest will find its way. He stared, then nodded slowly. As you wish, Ellie. And, she added, heart thudding, I would like you to send a note to Ravensfield's solicitors, thank His Grace for honouring his word, and tell them, she hesitated only a heartbeat, tell them that Miss Ashdown has no wish to vanish. If he wishes to speak with the woman she is now, not the girl in his sister's letters, she will be at home on Thursday at 4. Thursday arrived with an odd mixture of haste and reluctance. All morning, Eleanor moved through the house as if in a slightly altered dream. She conferred with Mr. Green about the proposed sale of the extra carriage, nodded through Lady Agatha's lamentations about voluntary austerity, and accepted her father's quiet, watching presence as he pretended to read a newspaper he had not turned a page of in half an hour. By 3 o'clock the drawing-room was spotless, the fire banked to a polite glow, and Lady Agatha had arranged the flowers no fewer than 3 times. I still say it is madness to sell the hunting box, her aunt muttered, adjusting a vase of early lilacs. Where will you go in the autumn? One must be seen in the country as well as town. One must first ensure there is something to be seen with, Eleanor replied mildly. A roof, for instance. Lady Agatha sniffed, but her hands fussed more gently over the blossoms. And this note you insisted we send, she went on. So, Bear, Miss Ashdown will be at home on Thursday at 4. No effusions, no urgings, no mention of your improved financial situation. Men like to feel they have chosen wisely. If he comes because I am now a more comfortable prospect, then I would prefer he stayed away, Eleanor said. I have had enough of being weighed on scales I did not set. Her aunt pursed her lips. You are unforgivably odd, child. Perhaps that is why he notices you. At 3:30, Eleanor dismissed her maid in self-defense and sat by the window with Julia's letter folded in her lap. She traced the faded ink with her thumb, hearing again the girlish voice that had written of her with such unearned certainty. I hope she never marries a stupid man, Julia had written. Eleanor smiled faintly. I shall do my best, she murmured, though clever men seem inclined to be foolish in their own particular ways. The mantel clock chimed the quarter hour. At 5 minutes to 4, Eleanor's pulse began to skip. At 4 precisely, carriage wheels sounded in the street below. Lady Agatha darkened the doorway, eyes alight. He is here, she whispered, as if announcing an eclipse. Mr. Ashdown rose from his seat near the hearth. Remember, he said quietly, whatever he offers you are not obliged. Not to him, not to me, not to anyone. She nodded, grateful for the words, even as her heart thudded against her ribs. The footman opened the drawing-room door. His Grace, the Duke of Ravensfield, he intoned. Ravensfield stood on the threshold, hat in hand. In the weeks since she had last seen him, something had altered. The elegant armour of his manner remained, the impeccable coat, the composed features, but there was a new gravity in the set of his mouth, a watchfulness that felt less like distance and more like care. Mr. Ashdown, Lady Agatha, Miss Ashdown. He bowed, each name measured, unhurried. Your Grace, Mr. Ashdown replied, you are welcome. Pray be seated, Lady Agatha added, gesturing eagerly to the best chair. We are delighted to— Aunt, Eleanor said gently, perhaps Papa might be so good as to escort you to the morning room. I believe you wish to review the household accounts. Lady Agatha stared. Accounts? Now? Yes, Eleanor said. Now. Mr. Green has suggested some economies. You were most anxious to be involved. Her aunt opened her mouth to protest, then caught the look in Eleanor's eyes. Something in it, steady, courteous, unyielding, made her pause. Well, she said at last, I suppose, yes. Very well. Mr. Ashdown, if you will. Her father suppressed a smile. Of course, Aggie. As the door closed behind them, the room felt larger, quieter, more honest. The Duke remained standing until Eleanor resumed her place on the sofa, then chose a chair opposite, not too near, not so distant as to feel formal. Thank you for agreeing to see me, he said. You kept your word, she replied, about the debts, about staying away unless I sent for you. It seemed Unkind not to keep mine. He inclined his head. I am glad you did. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable exactly. Charged. You received my sister's letter, he said, nodding toward the folded paper in her hand. Yes. Eleanor looked down at the familiar loops. I hardly know whether to thank you or scold you for sending it. I will accept both, he said. In what order you please. She smiled despite herself. Thank you. First, it was strange seeing myself through her eyes, kind and painful at once, and then scolding. You ought not to have carried me as some unanswered question all these years without ever intending to meet you, he supplied quietly. Yes, she said. It feels indecent. Like reading a diary someone never meant to leave open. He considered. You are not wrong, he admitted. If I could return to the moment I first saw your name in those letters, I might choose differently, or perhaps I would not. I only know that once I had met you, the question changed. Into what? She asked. Into whether the woman you had become would ever wish to know the man I have been, he said. Her breath caught. And do you wish me to know him? I do, he answered. Though I warn you, he is not always flattering. He has been arrogant, careless, and at times so consumed with his own guilt that he has used it as an excuse to control everything around him. She held his gaze. Including me, including you, he acknowledged. I told myself I was protecting you from Harrow's leverage. In truth, I was also trying to soothe an old wound in myself, one that belonged to Julia, not to you. That was unfair, I am sorry. The simplicity of the apology unsettled her more than any elaborate explanation could have. I do not know yet, she said slowly, whether I can forgive you entirely. But I do not wish you gone either, and that confuses me. It confuses me as well, he said, a faint, self-mocking smile ghosting across his mouth. I am more accustomed to being certain. She drew a breath. Then perhaps we might begin with a smaller question. By all means, he replied. Did you come today as my creditor, my rescuer, or my suitor? She asked. Because I can tolerate the first, appreciate the second, and consider the third, but I cannot bear all three at once. His answer was immediate. I came, he said, as a man who hopes very much to be your suitor, but only if you will allow him to stand beside you, not before you. The rest, the debts, the letters, the past, I am prepared to lay at your feet and abide by whatever judgment you make. Her heart began to beat in her throat. And if my judgment is unkind, she whispered, then I will accept it, he said, and do what I can, quietly, to deserve a kinder one in some distant future. She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the shadow of manipulation she had come to expect from men accustomed to power. What she saw instead was a man stripped of certainty, holding out his hope like something that might break. Your Grace, she said at last, if you mean to court me, then you must do so under one condition. He straightened, as if bracing for some impossible demand. Name it. That you allow me, she said, to learn who I am without you, and that you be willing to be chosen, not needed. A strange, bright light flared in his eyes. Eleanor, he said softly, no one has ever asked so little and so much of me in one breath. He rose then, as if sitting could no longer contain him, and crossed the small distance between them. He did not sit beside her, but he sank to one knee on the carpet, not in practiced proposal, but in unvarnished supplication. Then let us strike a bargain, he said, looking up at her. Not of estates or titles, but of hearts. I will give you time to discover who you are, and I will show you who I am when I am not arranging anyone's life, not my sister's, not yours, and when you know us both fully, he swallowed. Then you will tell me whether I am a man you can love. Her hand trembled in her lap. And if my answer is no, she managed. A shadow crossed his face, but his voice did not waver. Then I will rise, he said, and walk out of this house, and I will leave the words in Julia's letters as the only claim I ever made upon you. The clock on the mantel ticked, measuring out the silence as Eleanor's world narrowed to the man at her feet and the choice he had placed, at last, honestly in her hands. For a long moment Eleanor could not speak. The sight of him on one knee, this man who had seemed to the rest of the world unbendable, had turned something powerfully inside out. Not because society would swoon at the image, but because it felt so very unlike a performance, and so very much like surrender. She set Julia's letter carefully on the table and rose. Your Grace, she said softly, please stand. I cannot think while you are there. His brows lifted, but he obeyed at once, unfolding to his full height. Up close he seemed suddenly less formidable and more human, a little tired, a little hopeful, entirely attentive. "Better?" he asked. "Not at all," she said, a breath of laughing honesty escaping. "But at least I do not feel as if I am sentencing a supplicant." Something in his shoulders eased. "That was not my intention," he said, "though I suppose I meant you to feel the weight of the choice." "I do," she replied, "and I take it seriously. Too seriously, perhaps, which is why—" She drew a steadying breath. "Which is why I cannot answer you today." He went very still. "I see. Not no," she added quickly. "Not go away and never return. Only not yet. You asked me to tell you, when I knew us both fully, whether you are a man I can love. I am not arrogant enough to believe I know you fully after a ball, a drive in the park, and a quarrel about ledgers." His mouth twitched. "Those are, however, an excellent start." She almost smiled. "Perhaps. But if we are to attempt this, whatever this is, we must do it properly. No rescues without consent. No decisions made in secret. No using debts or gossip or Julia's memory as levers." He nodded once, solemn. "Agreed. And," she continued, before courage could desert her, "I wish for time that is not a performance. Moments when we are not on a ballroom floor or in a carriage under the eyes of half of London. If I am to judge whether I can love you, I must see who you are when there is no audience." His expression softened into something she had not quite seen before, unguarded, almost tender. "Then grant me the same privilege," he said quietly. "Allow me to see who you are when you are not bracing for the next blow." Her throat tightened. "I hardly know that woman myself." "Then we shall make her acquaintance together," he replied. She looked at him, at the careful distance he kept, despite the intensity of his gaze, and felt something within her shift, like a door opening onto a room she had not known existed. "Very well," she said. "You may court me on these terms." A slow breath left him, as if some held tension had unwound. "Then I am, for the first time in many years, a man under a lady's terms," he said. "You have my word that I will honor them." "And I," she answered, "will do my best not to judge you entirely by the actions of other men." "That," he said, a glimmer of wry humor returning, "is more generosity than I have any right to expect." They talked a little then of practicalities, of calls and walks, and how to manage Lady Agatha's inevitable theatrics. When he left, he did so with a bow that held a new kind of respect, and a glance that lingered a heartbeat longer than propriety demanded. Days slipped into weeks. Their courtship unfolded, not in grand gestures, but in small, accumulating moments. He called in the late afternoons, when the light slanted soft through the drawing-room windows. Sometimes they walked in the quiet corners of the park, where the gravel paths were less trodden and the gossips thinner. Sometimes they stayed indoors, talking by the library fire. While rain traced silver lines down the panes, he kept his promise with almost unnerving scrupulousness. He spoke frankly of estate matters when she asked, shared stories of Julia that were as often ridiculous as they were poignant, and admitted, on one particularly raw, windy day, that he still woke some nights convinced he had failed her. "You were not her god," Eleanor said gently. "You were her brother." "That is precisely my point," he replied. "Gods one can excuse, brothers ought to be better." She, in turn, allowed him glimpses of herself she had never offered another man. She spoke of missing her mother so fiercely some days that it felt like a fresh wound, of her fear that without someone else's need to answer, she would find herself empty. "You are not an instrument that stops when it is not played," he said. "You are music in your own right." The words stayed with her, long after he had gone. Society watched, of course. Invitations multiplied. There were raised brows and pressed lips, but there were also nods of grudging approval. A duke's consistent attention, given over several weeks with no visible wavering, was a language even the most skeptical understood. Marianne visited less often, but when she did, she no longer fluttered with anxious apologies. Instead, she asked practical questions about budgets and charity committees, as if trying to learn from Eleanor how to turn a life arranged for her into one she could bear. Edmund, when Eleanor encountered him at a musicale, bowed with grave courtesy and did not seek private conversation. His eyes, she noticed, were no longer puzzled but resigned. Whatever feelings he might have once held, he seemed at last to have recognized that the door between them had closed. One evening, as the season began to warm toward its height, Mr. Ashdown set aside his paper and studied his daughter over the top of it. "You are different," he said. "In what way?" she asked, alert for worry. "More yourself," he replied. "Less waiting. I find that I can look at you and see not what might have been lost but what might yet be gained." She thought of Ravensfield then, of the man who had once tried to rearrange her life without permission and who now seemed determined to rearrange himself instead. "I feel," she said slowly, "as if I have stepped into a room I did not know belonged to me, and there is light. and a chair that is mine to sit in, and people are knocking at the door. And will you let them in? Her father asked. She smiled a little. One at a time, I think. It was nearly 2 months after that first awkward kneeling in the drawing room when Ravensfield sent a note in his own hand, rather than through his solicitor. If your terms allow it, he wrote, I would like to show you Ravensfield House, not as an estate to be assessed, but as the place where I am most myself. There is a portrait I think you ought to see. Eleanor read the lines twice, fingers hovering over the signature. When she arrived at Ravensfield House a week later, the sky hung low with clouds like brushed wool. The great house rose from the parkland with a kind of understated confidence, less ostentatious than some but solid, deeply rooted. He met her at the door himself, without fanfare. Thank you for coming, he said, taking her cloak. It is not a small thing, I know. No, she agreed, but it feels necessary. He led her through quiet corridors that smelled faintly of beeswax and old linen, past rooms that bore the subtle marks of a household lived in, not displayed. They paused before a set of double doors. In here, he said, if you are ready. She nodded. He opened the doors and stepped aside. The room beyond was flooded with soft northern light. On one wall above a low sofa hung a portrait of a young woman with laughing eyes and a hint of mischief in her mouth. Julia. Eleanor drew in a breath. She did not remember the girl from school in detail, but the energy in the painted face felt achingly familiar. She looks as if she were about to argue with the painter, Eleanor said, stepping closer. She did, Ravensfield replied, coming to stand beside her. He wanted her to sit with a book in her lap. She insisted on standing, said she would not be painted, as if she were waiting for life to happen to her. A smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. Then she would be disappointed in me if I required you to kneel a second time. She would be disappointed in us both, he answered. They stood in silence side by side, looking up at the girl whose words had first bound their names together. Eleanor, he said at last, voice low, I brought you here because it seemed wrong to ask you a question in any other room. She turned to him, heart suddenly loud. What question? She whispered, though she thought she already knew. He drew a breath, as if steadying himself. After all these weeks, he said, knowing who I am, and beginning to know who you are when you are not losing yourself for others. Am I a man you can love? For a moment, Eleanor could not look at him. Julia's painted eyes seemed to follow her, bright with the same fierce curiosity that had once underlined her name in a schoolgirl letter. The girl in the portrait had believed with unshaken conviction that Eleanor Ashdown should never marry a stupid man, or, Eleanor thought now, a careless one. She walked a few slow steps away, the echo of her shoes soft on the wooden floor, and stood before the tall window. Outside, clouds drifted low over the parkland, their edges touched with a pale, reluctant light. The world was still turning. It always did. 3 months ago, she said at last, without turning, I would have said no. She heard his breath catch. I would have said no, she continued, because I did not know who I was without belonging to someone else, a daughter, a fiancé, a consolation prize. I would have clung to you like a drowning woman clings to anything that floats. And that is not love. It is fear. She turned then. He stood very still, hands at his sides, every line of him held in check. Only his eyes betrayed him, dark, intent, and just now shadowed with a fear of their own. And now, he asked quietly, who are you now? She let the question rest on her tongue for a heartbeat. Now I'm a woman who has looked at ledgers and let go of houses, she said, who has learned that she can live with less lace and fewer invitations and still be herself. I am a woman who was humiliated in front of half of London and did not vanish, who told a duke that she would walk away from him if he tried to rearrange her life without permission. A faint, helpless smile touched his mouth. I recall that last part with particular clarity. So when you ask if you are a man I can love, she went on, I must answer you as the woman I am now, not the girl in Julia's letters. And she, Eleanor felt something in her settle, like a key turning in a long stuck lock. She finds that she already does. Silence, soft and astonished, filled the room. You already do, he said, as if testing each word for cracks. Yes. She felt oddly calm. I did not notice at first. It came in pieces. In the way you told me to look at you, not the crowd. In the way you said we when you spoke of my debts, then taught yourself to say you instead. In the way you admitted you were afraid. I have spent my whole life watching men pretend they are not afraid. I do not wish to spend the rest of it doing so. He moved then as if something had broken loose inside him. In 3 strides he stood before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, etched by years of frowning at the world. Eleanor, he said, her name a quiet exhale. If I had known how to ask you to love me, I would have done it sooner. You are asking now, she replied, in the only way I could trust. He lifted a hand slowly, giving her time to step back if she chose. When she did not, he touched her cheek with the barest brush of his fingers, as if even now he did not quite believe she was real. "Then I will be plain," he said. "Will you marry me? Not to rescue your father, or to spite Edmund, or to satisfy Julia's ghost? Will you marry me because the thought of walking through the rest of this unruly, inconvenient life without you has become unbearable?" Her laugh came out thick with unshed tears. "You do choose your words," she said. "Unbearable is not a thing most men would admit." "Most men," he answered, "have not spent the last weeks discovering that they are quieter inside your company than they have been anywhere in years." Her heart ached in the way bones ache when they begin to heal. "Yes," she said simply, "I will marry you." It was not a thunderclap. No trumpet sounded. No doors burst open. The world did not rearrange itself at once. Instead, something subtler happened. The tightness in his shoulders eased, as if a weight he had carried so long he no longer felt it had finally been set down. "Thank you," he said, and she realized with a start that he meant it literally, as if her yes were a gift, not a prize he had expected all along. He did not kiss her then, not fully. He bent instead and pressed his lips to her brow, a reverent, trembling touch that felt more binding than any embrace. "Julia," he murmured, glancing up at the portrait with a wry, wet shine in his eyes, "if you disapprove, you must object now." The painted girl only smiled back at them, forever on the verge of some new adventure. London, of course, had its opinions. There were those who said Eleanor had trapped him. Others insisted he had plucked her from ruin out of boredom. Some whispered that he would tire of her. Others, more shrewd, remarked that she had changed him. Eleanor learned to let the chatter wash around her like rain on a window. Inside, there was warmth. On the night of their wedding, which was quieter than Marianne's but no less sincere, Eleanor stood a moment at the edge of the crowded room and watched her cousin laughing with Edmund, her father speaking with Mr. Green, Lady Agatha proudly explaining to anyone who would listen that she had always known Eleanor would do something remarkable. The Duke came to stand beside her. "Overwhelmed?" he asked. "A little," she admitted, "but not undone." He held out his hand. "Shall we give them one more story to tell, Mrs. Ravensfield?" She slipped her fingers into his. "Only if we dance for ourselves, not for them." "As you wish," he said. They stepped onto the floor. The music rose around them, warm and full, and as they turned together, Eleanor realized that she did not feel as if she were on a stage any longer. She felt, simply, seen, and this time, she had chosen it. Later, when the candles burned low and the guests had gone, Eleanor would sit by a window in her new home with a letter in her lap and a husband asleep in a chair beside her, one hand loosely hooked over the armrest, as if even in rest he did not quite trust the world not to shift. She would look at Julia's looping words and think of the girl who had once watched her across a schoolroom and believed she deserved more than a stupid man. "You were right," she would whisper, "but you were wrong about one thing." She would glance at the sleeping Duke, his features softer in the quiet. "He is not clever instead of kind," she would murmur. "He is both, and so am I." And somewhere, in that place where memories and hopes meet, a girl with laughing eyes and ink-stained fingers would smile in fierce satisfaction, because in the end, the story had not been about a man who rescued a woman or a woman who saved a man. It had been about a woman who chose to be seen, and a man who learned how to stand beside her without blocking the light. And that, Eleanor knew now, was a love worth being brave for. If you have ever felt like a consolation prize, like someone rearranged your life without asking, remember Eleanor. Remember the night she chose to step out onto a terrace instead of applauding her own heartbreak. Remember the day she told the most desired man in the room that she would rather stand alone than be managed. Love is not a rescue, and you are not a debt to be paid. You are allowed to be seen on your own terms and to choose a love that stands beside you, not in front of you.